Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking an intensive deep dive into what might seem like a pretty simple Hebrew noun, but one that carries just an extraordinary theological force. The word is gōpri.
That's right.
It's the word for brimstone, and it only appears a handful of times in the Hebrew scriptures. But every single time it shows up, it's making a statement about divine action and separation.
And that's a great way to frame it. I mean, we aren't just looking at a mineral here. We're looking at an instrument.
An instrument. I like that.
Our mission today is really to synthesize what our sources tell us, the linguistic background, the physical science behind it, and then the biblical usage, to get a handle on why this specific substance was chosen to define God's acts of judgment.
And you might be asking, why spend all this time focused on a single noun? You know, a 7-letter word that's often just translated as sulfur. Well, because this one word is basically shorthand for absolute catastrophe. It defines the nature of God's justice in some of the most memorable narratives, from Sodom right through to the visions of the prophets. It's really an essential building block for understanding the scope of his holiness.
It is. And the sources let us connect the dots, from the physical element, the sulfur, to its consistent, unyielding role as a figure of ultimate cleansing.
Yeah.
It's not just a destructive agent. When it gets on the scene, it signifies an expression of God's perfect righteousness being actualized. It's setting boundaries that cannot be crossed or renegotiated.
So let's jump in. I think we need to start by grounding ourselves in the physical reality before we even touch the theology. Let's talk about the substance itself.
Good place to start.
So when the biblical authors mention inheritio, what are they actually talking about? What would an ancient person see or touch or smell?
Okay, so the primary meaning, like our source notes say, is sulfur, or brimstone, which is just the older English word for it.
Right.
It's defined as a non-metallic element. When we picture it, you should probably think of these brittle, crystalline stones or chunks. It's a naturally occurring thing.
And you'd find it in certain places, right?
Right, often in regions with volcanic activity or near geological vents. And it's really noted for its distinctive yellow color.
So if you were living in the ancient Near East, especially somewhere like the Dead Sea Rift Valley, this wouldn't be a foreign substance. You would have seen these yellowish deposits. It's tangible.
Absolutely. And our notes are quite specific about its sensory profile before you light it. It's described as tasteless and, interestingly, odorless.
Odorless. That's surprising. We always associate sulfur with that rotten egg smell.
Well, that smell is actually hydrogen sulfide.
Yeah.
Pure solid sulfur itself doesn't have a strong odor. So tasteless, odorless, yellow, and crystalloid.
Okay, so that initial state is crucial. It's a common, if, distinctive element. But its theological weight, as you said, comes from its properties when it burns.
Entirely. Understanding the chemical reality is what grounds the entire metaphor used later in Scripture.
So let's get to that reaction. We all know fire in Hebrew is hot. It consumes. But what is so unique about the combustion of Hebrew? What happens when this yellow rock actually burns?
Okay, so when sulfur burns in air, a couple things happen at once that just elevate it far beyond a typical fire. First, visually, it produces this really distinctive, almost beautiful blue flame. But second, and this is the reason it's selected as an instrument of divine wrath, the process releases poisonous, noxious fumes.
And we're talking about sulfur dioxide here, a suffocating, corrosive gas.
Exactly.
That is a total game changer for the imagery of judgment. I mean, fire destroys by heat, sure, but it introduces this layer of chemical warfare, of environmental toxicity that fire alone just doesn't have.
That's the point.
It's not just burning a city down, it's making the very atmosphere lethal.
Precisely. This scientific reality is what gives the theological metaphor its teeth. This stuff isn't just hot. It is corrosive, it is suffocating, and it is completely desolating. It doesn't just destroy, it contaminates.
Contaminates, that's the word.
So if judgment is meant to be comprehensive, removing the sin and the environment that fostered the sin, then that's the perfect material for the job.
That distinction, destruction versus contamination, that seems vital. If God sends a fire, maybe survivors can come back and rebuild on the ashes. But if God rains down brimstone, the land itself is left poisoned. The destruction isn't just in the moment from the heat and the blue flame, but it lingers because those poisonous fumes have permeated everything.
Right. And think about the practical difference. An ordinary fire leaves ash, and life often returns pretty quickly. But if the soil itself is permeated by sulfurous residue, especially when combined with that fire, well, it creates conditions where vegetation is just going to struggle to come back.
It sterilizes the ground.
It does. The sources highlight that this is a desolation that's both immediate and final, and this aligns completely with the biblical purpose, symbolizing the severity and the permanency of God's separation from unrighteousness.
And when you think about the geographical context of its first major appearance, near the Dead Sea, a region known for bitumen and sulfur deposits, it just brings the judgment into sharp relief. The mechanism for the destruction was right there. It was scientifically understood, even if the scale of the event in Genesis was supernatural. It used a real-world, highly destructive material to execute a sovereign judgment.
And that familiarity is key. They weren't using some abstract concept. They were using a material they knew to be volatile and toxic, especially if you were near volcanic or geothermal activity. This makes the act of raining down a very specific, devastating, and definitive act. It implies not just death, but utter eradication, sterilization of the landscape.
Okay, so moving from the physical reality of it, let's look at the history of the word itself. Etymology can often reveal the core concept before all the theological weight gets applied. Where did this specific word, gōpri, even come from? Our source material points to a couple of different possibilities, which makes the trail pretty interesting.
It does. The linguistic trail suggests that this word, as we know it, may have evolved its meaning over time. It seems to reflect how ancient peoples grouped materials based on their function, rather than their chemical structure.
It's not what they are.
Exactly. So one theory proposes that AP is a feminine form related to the Semitic root 1613, which is
gōper. That immediately takes us back to Noah. That's the wood of the ark. But the linguists who support this theory, they aren't focused on the wood itself, are they?
No, not at all. They focus on the materials associated with it. The theory suggests that gōper, or its related concepts, might have initially referred to pitch, or maybe a cypress resin, basically a highly flammable and sticky substance used for sealing and waterproofing.
Ah, okay. So the argument is that the name for pitch, a substance known for being volatile, for its intense burning, for its sealing nature, was then transferred by analogy to other highly inflammable materials. And that includes sulfur.
That's the idea.
So what's the common thread here? I mean, the chemical compositions are completely different.
The common property is combustion, and its utility in extreme heat. Pitch is organic, but it burns violently, leaves a residue. Sulfur is an element, but it also burns violently and leaves a residue. For an ancient person, that functional similarity, being highly flammable, useful for sealing or starting intense fires, that was more relevant than its chemical identity. This suggests that the terrifying flammability was the defining characteristic that led to the naming convention.
That makes perfect sense. They categorize by observable properties, by what things do. Now let's broaden the view a bit. This word didn't exist in a vacuum. This idea of a destructive material is clearly widespread based on the huge network of cognates our sources identify across the whole ancient Near East.
That's vital context. The sheer breadth of its linguistic relatives confirms that this was a material, or at least a concept, of a highly volatile toxic substance that was universally recognized. It was recognized across all these regional cultures, which just strengthens its authority when it's used in Scripture.
Can you give us a sense of that regional recognition without getting too bogged down in the transcription details?
Sure. We find clear equivalents in Middle Hebrew and Jewish Aramaic. We see forms in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, Egyptian Aramaic, and notably we see it in Syriac and Mandaic, two major Semitic language families. And critically, this concept traveled into Akkadian, which called it kubrītu, and then later into Arabic as kibrīt.
The connection to Akkadian, the language of the Mesopotamian empires, that's especially telling. It indicates the substance and its use in contexts of severe desolation was firmly rooted in the ancient regional vocabulary of destruction and purification, long before the biblical narratives were even codified.
Absolutely. That shared lexical field ensures that the theological message of Gaf wouldn't have been mysterious or isolated. It was leveraging a well-established, universal understanding of a destructive material of the highest order.
But the sources don't stop there. There's an alternative theory that suggests it might not be Semitic at all.
That's right. Some linguistic scholars raise the possibility that it's a non-Semitic loanword, a concept adopted through trade or cultural exchange. There's speculation it might derive from a Bactrian term, vohûkereti.
Bactrian. So that would push its origins far to the east.
Right, possibly connecting it to Indo-Iranian language groups.
And if that's the case, if it is a loanword, what does that suggest about the material?
It suggests that either the material itself or maybe the technology associated with it Perhaps advanced mining or uses of sulfur originated outside the standard Semitic linguistic sphere, and it was imported along trade routes.
So whether it came from the word for cypress pitch or from Bactrian trade, the synthesis is the same.
It's the same. By the time of the Torah, was the recognized term for a volatile, combustive, and environmentally destructive element. Its linguistic history just reinforces why it was selected for describing the most serious, definitive acts of divine judgment.
Okay, so we have a material known to burn fiercely, emit toxic fumes, and sterilize the land. And we have a word for it that is universally recognized across the ancient Near East. This really sets the stage for its dramatic entrance in the Torah.
It does.
And the weight of this word truly coalesces around its initial defining appearance in Genesis 19.24. This isn't just an accidental use. This is the moment that established the theological vocabulary of judgment by brimstone for all subsequent scripture.
Genesis 19.24 is the cornerstone reference. The context is the sovereign decisive judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. And the text is incredibly precise. He said, he's tardy, you raise, and
and Yahweh rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire. Let's break down the verbs here. The use of him here, he caused to rain. That immediately signals this was a specific, deliberate, sovereign act from above. This is not a natural disaster.
Absolutely not. The mechanism is heavenly precipitation. But the content of that precipitation isn't water. It's gōper, brimstone, and fire. This pairing is non-negotiable. It established brimstone as the physical instrument of sudden, catastrophic divine action.
And because this incident was so cataclysmic, the phrase brimstone and fire becomes the ultimate shorthand for total, irreversible judgment throughout the rest of the Bible.
It's the metonymy for it, yes.
And when we connect this back to our first section, we realize this wasn't just heat. The destruction of the plain was a full-on environmental poisoning, a toxic catastrophe that rendered the entire area instantly deadly and uninhabitable.
The destruction was complete. Physically, chemically, ecologically. It was a theological statement about the utter rejection of the sin that defined those cities.
The completeness is the point.
It is. The destruction had to match the severity of the offense. And remember the geographical analysis of the area. The cities were located in the well-watered plain of the Jordan, a place described as being like the Garden of Eden.
Right.
For the Lord to destroy this lush region by raining down fire and a toxic sterilizing agent, well, it speaks to the absolute finality of the separation being enacted.
And this foundational event then informs the covenantal warnings that follow. We see this judgment echoed directly in Deuteronomy 29, where Moses describes the fate of Israel if they abandon the covenant.
Yes, in Deuteronomy 29, verse 22 or 20, depending on the translation, Moses is painting a picture of a cursed land, a place of desolation. The Hebrew is kol akadah, all its land is a burning or a thorough devastation. But the agents of destruction listed here are modified. And this adds a key detail. It says the land is brimstone and salt.
Brimstone and salt. Fire is implied by the word burning, but the agents explicitly named are sulfur and salt. That's highly specific. It's instructive. We know what sulfur does. It's the immediate toxic agent. Why does Moses include salt here in this covenantal warning?
The inclusion of salt, malaka, seals the permanence of the curse. Salt was universally understood in the ancient Near East as a sterilizing agent. When a conquering army wanted to send a message that a city would never rise again, they would sow the fields with salt.
So it prevents germination. It kills the land's ability to support life.
Exactly. So if brimstone signifies that initial, toxic, violent separation, salt signifies the enduring, legislative, sterile curse that follows. Paired together, they symbolize a complete and irreversible desolation of the soil and the land's habitability. It is a judgment designed to be a permanent, geographical signpost of disobedience.
So it connects the historical precedent of Sodom directly to Israel's future covenant responsibilities. Moses is essentially saying, if you break this covenant, the consequences will be modeled on the most absolute and comprehensive destruction history has ever seen.
Your land will not just be defeated. It will be rendered as barren and uninhabitable as the valley of Siddim. That's the message.
Wow. That makes the Deuteronomic warning even more severe. It suggests that the Lord's righteousness demands not just the removal of a wicked generation, but the permanent alteration of the environment that harbored the sin. It ensures it remains a memorial to disobedience for generations to come.
That's right.
Okay, so once Genesis established brimstone's literal meaning, the poets and prophets start using yeth to articulate the inevitability and severity of divine justice across all time. It becomes a symbolic device.
It does. And our sources show its use is entirely consistent. It's always a figure of judgment, and it's always coupled with fire or similar concepts.
And that consistency is what gives the term its reliability. A reader knows immediately what level of severity is being described. So let's look at Psalm 11.6. This is a direct address to the judgment reserved for the wicked.
Yes, the psalmist here describes a really chilling picture of punitive action. The Hebrew is airier brimstone and a scorching or terrible wind.
Okay, so notice how the fire and brimstone are augmented here by ruk zilafut. This isn't a gentle breeze.
Not at all. This is a wind of burning heat. It's often translated as a hot, scorching, or even a pestilential tempest. This combination just elevates the judgment to an environmental nightmare. The fire consumes, the wind scatters and scorches, but the brimstone ensures the judgment is poisonous and suffocating.
In a poetic context like this, the brimstone adds a sensory reality that pure fire lacks. It adds the smell of toxicity, the stifling sensation of fumes, the chemical corrosion. It's a targeted, toxic execution of wrath that affects the very air the wicked breathe, demonstrating that even the natural elements are enlisted in God's judgment.
And moving from the general wicked in the Psalms, we see Job 18.15 using the imagery to describe the fate of the habitation of the wicked. He says, brimstone is scattered upon his habitation.
This reference, while it's brief, is highly resonant. It signifies utter abandonment, ruin. If brimstone is scattered on a dwelling, it means that dwelling is now permanently uninhabitable. It's cursed ground. It just reinforces that desolation theme we first saw in Deuteronomy about the cursed land.
It acts as a kind of theological shorthand. If the settlement has been visited by brimstone, it needs no further explanation about the source or the severity. It is abandoned because it has been rendered chemically and spiritually unfit for life. This aligns with the principle that the fate of the wicked is complete separation from blessed space.
Okay, let's pivot to Isaiah 30.33. This is where the figurative language becomes incredibly intense because it connects the destructive agent directly to the immediate person of God.
This passage is describing Topheth, a place often associated with severe judgment and destruction. And the image presented is just arresting. It says the breath of Yahweh, Nimed YHWH, is compared to a stream or a torrent of brimstone. It's an active, ongoing volcanic outpouring of toxicity.
That's a radical inversion of God's typical creative action. I mean, usually the breath of God is associated with the giving of life, nephesh, soul, spirit. But here that same breath is the destructive, suffocating force, and it's manifested as toxic sulfur.
It moves the source of judgment from an external meteorological event, like the rain in Genesis, to the immediate personal agency of the divine. The judgment isn't mediated through external forces. It originates from his essential holiness. This intensifies the idea that the wicked are consumed by the absolute purity of the divine presence, which to anything unrighteous manifests as noxious, consuming fire.
This visual articulation is just stunning. God's holiness is so absolute that his very breath, when it's directed against sin, results in a torrent of suffocating, sterilizing brimstone. It really underscores the active role of God in executing his righteousness.
And the imagery continues and even escalates in Isaiah 34, specifically verses 9 and 10, when describing the total judgment upon Edom. The land doesn't just receive brimstone, it becomes it.
The scenario is apocalyptic. It says the streams of the land turn to pitch, and the land's dust, apar, turns to... This is not mere visitation. This is a transformation of the entire ecosystem.
This signifies the ultimate environmental corruption and ruin. Once the soil, the dust itself, is converted into toxic, volatile sulfur, that land is eternally defiled. The earth itself becomes the testimony to the irreversible judgment. This fulfills the Deuteronomic concept of desolation, but takes it to a poetic, cosmic extreme. It establishes a scorched, poisoned legacy that warns all who see it.
It suggests the consequence of God's judgment is self-sustaining desolation. The land isn't just destroyed, it is now made up of the materials of its own destruction, perpetually toxic, incapable of supporting life.
Right. And finally, we see this concept consistently applied to future eschatological events, like the judgment against Gog in Ezekiel 38.22.
This usage confirms that it's not relegated to ancient history. It's a concept that's part of the final vocabulary of cleansing and judgment against the enemies of God. It's paired once again with fire and other catastrophic elements, maintaining its consistent association with definitive cleansing fire that brings about complete separation between the holy and the profane.
The model established in Genesis, that irreversible toxic destruction, it remains the standard for God's dealing with corporate unrighteousness. and it spans from historical acts to the very end of time. This linguistic consistency across the whole canon is what makes just such a powerful theological marker.
So as we transition toward our takeaway, let's just briefly consider how this theologically heavy term was translated into Greek. That was the foundation for so much later interpretation. Was that sense of toxicity and fire maintained?
It was. When the Septuagint, the early Greek translation, rendered gōperi, the translators showed a clear understanding of its central meaning. They primarily used the terms kamian and the eos, which translate directly to sulfur or brimstone.
And that linguistic continuity is significant. It shows that irrespective of the nuanced Hebrew etymological debate about pitch or resin,
Right.
the physical reality of the destructive sulfurous element was the undisputed associative meaning that was carried forward into subsequent scripture and commentary.
And that continuity brings us to the core synthesis. The word carries a fixed associative meaning. Absolute judgment and punishment. It's never used neutrally. It is always connected to fire, to separation, and to destruction.
So it's the ultimate shorthand for purification through destruction by fire and noxious toxic agents. The choice of this specific substance sulfur is intentional. It conveys a level of severity and comprehensiveness that a general term like disaster or even just fire can't capture. It underscores that God's acts of separation are deliberate and targeted.
The consistent association throughout the history of Revelation, from the literal historical destruction of the plain, through the covenantal warnings of Deuteronomy, into the poetic justice of the Psalms, and finally projected onto the ultimate eschatological judgments in Ezekiel. It all shows that the term for brimstone is reserved for the most uncompromising expressions of God's holy wrath against unrighteousness.
It's not just a descriptive word for a mineral, it's a theological marker. It defines the boundary where God's presence acts to cleanse by complete, irreversible desolation. And it helps us understand the radical extent of his holiness.
It does.
So we started with this single noun, and through the lens of our sources, we've discovered a really dense history. It linked us to ancient concepts of volatility and combustion, whether that was derived from pitch or adopted through trade. We established the harsh, undeniable reality of sulfur's poisonous, corrosive properties. And we traced how these physical properties were systematically leveraged by the biblical authors to convey a consistent figure of divine separation and judgment. The destruction associated with Illa is never ambiguous or partial. It is always utter, whether you're describing the smoking ruin of Sodom or the burning dust that marks the end of an afflicted era. This continuity speaks volumes about the consistency of God's approach to unrighteousness. It demonstrates that the judgment is always final and complete.
So this deep dive really clarifies our reading of these verses. When we see brimstone, we should understand not just fire, but a toxic, suffocating, sterilizing finality. It demonstrates that what God sets aside is permanently separated. And this leads us to reflect on the meaning of that severity. We've learned that it's scientifically defined by its ability to generate noxious fumes and leave a land desolate when combined with fire and salt, chemically altering the ground. So what does this consistent choice of gōperi as the specific instrument of judgment tell you about the degree of holiness required in God's presence? And why must the cleansing of sin, as depicted in a place like Deuteronomy 29.22, result not merely in destruction, but in the complete moral and physical sterilization of the environment of unrighteousness? Think about the radical necessity of that final toxic separation.